Today's businesses are on a vigilant watch for threats in an ongoing cyber war. It's time to get real-world solutions to protect and secure your valuable business information anytime, anywhere. Welcome to Cybersecurity America with Josh Nicholson. You're about to gain special access into a world of restricted information and a backstage pass to the inner sanctum of cybersecurity operations. Here's your host, Joshua Nicholson.
Awesome. Welcome to the show, Cybersecurity America. I'm your host again, Joshua Nicholson. Today's episode is on threat intelligence in the enterprise and in small businesses. It was always fascinating about understanding what the attackers are doing before they do it. What does threat intelligence mean to us? And how do you utilize it? How do you benefit does it have in a modern day enterprise? And what should you focus on if you want to have a threat intelligence program? You don't really know where to start. You're still trying to understand what's good, what's not. What does good look like? What is a low level maturity? What should I invest in? That kind of stuff. We want to be able to give those guidance and that feedback, give you some real world experience, some backstage experience of what's happening at real world experience. In today's topic, we're going to talk about that, the 2022 look back on threat intelligence. What did we get right? What did we miss? We're going to do an overview of the intelligence world and history. We're going to do some statistics to talk about industry analysis, describe how we can improve on strategic and tactical intelligence consumption, and then what's the difference between the two. And then the next topic we get into really is the 2023 strategic roadmaps. And this is where we have the horizon outlook. What's everybody focused on when it comes to threat intelligence? What are some terms and acronyms that are used? A lot of times there's acronyms that are thrown around in all kind of different environments. What are some of the acronyms that are very specific to threat intelligence? And then talk about the solar winds, a lot of these celebrity vulnerabilities that we've seen, and how did threat intelligence play into those, and how was it able to get us around the corner? And then just understanding what are the big predictions, like threat intelligence is predicting we're going to have attacks in this area, or what is that giving us from a prediction model? And the first thing I want to do is introduce my two guests. We're just really grateful to have two really strong threat intelligence professionals here. Both have government experience. The first one is Aaron Bierlin. So Aaron is an intelligence analyst with over 13 years of experience. Aaron is the capabilities leader over at Deep Seas, Cyber Threat Intelligence, CTI. So Aaron began his intelligence career in the United States Army, where he served in Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation New Dawn. So Aaron's military intelligence experience and focus was on intelligence-driven operations, had aided several large clients to transition their intelligence program into innovative, threat-informed, industry-leading organizations, and helping to prepare for the threats that they will face in the future. Our second guest is Nate Vidal. Nate has over 22 years of combined senior military, cyber, and consulting and program management experience within cybersecurity. He's familiar with delivering client solutions in ever-growing mission space. He specializes in driving innovative cybersecurity solutions across multiple capabilities to include strategy, design, and implementation of Cyber Fusion Center capabilities. And so what is a Cyber Fusion Center? Cyber Fusion Center is the capabilities that are fused together from a cyber threat intelligence, cyber or threat defense operations, or TDO, attack surface reduction, we call ASR, enterprise risk management, as well as cybersecurity strategy, supply chain, and incident response. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Aaron, Nate, so glad to have you.
Thanks for having me on, Josh.
So Aaron, what didn't I cover in your bio? I know both of you have done some high-speed, low-drag stuff in your career. So you want to give a little bit more background on who Aaron Bierlin is?
As the resident intelligence guy running around for a lot of companies and stuff, the real background of it and my most largest pride was doing a lot of training, and doing a lot of that when it was involved with in the military, in the Army, is training up new intelligence analysts. And that's like my passion project when working in this industry, is bringing up that new blood. But also part that wasn't included was having the ability to work with Army Cyber Command as it stood up and developed its own cyber center and became an actual combatant command, and working under the current director of the NSA, General Nakasone, and being able to brief and work with him. That was my first real experience out of the military and going into cyber. That shaped a lot. And so it gave me a lot of really good context, a lot of fun stories, of course, and all of that. But for the most part, I'm just the nerdy intel guy hanging out in Virginia, and that's about it.
Nerdy intel guy in Virginia. I love it. Nate, why don't you give us a little more information on your background?
Absolutely, Josh. As you saw, there's a lot of different areas and cover points, but yet again, the majority of my career began wearing a uniform service, with that being just supporting many aspects of the cyber domain. What I would say is that kind of really prepped me to get to the stage and where I'm at right now. The thing that we learned a lot from when we wore the uniform and is you really got to become that subject matter expert in many of the places that you get into, and training the next people that come behind you so that they're prepped to take on the baton and kind of take off from you, because you're really not going to be there forever. And I felt as I went down to many places, saw many things when it came to the cyber battlefield, I would say met a tremendous amount of great mentors, trainers that allowed me to then train other people and then allowed me to really get to the point where I am right now. Big shout out to many folks and many three-letter agencies who have really took care of me along the way and then put me where I'm at right now. Yeah, great to be here.
Does it help working at the NSA and doing these different high-speed, low-drag things and then going to the civilian world? Is it like a huge disappointment going, oh, man, we don't see this or do this anymore, and I'm just so limited? Is it really a culture shock going from NSA to the civilian world?
I would say, from my experience, it wasn't tremendously shocking. What I felt was shocking was just the processes. I felt like the importance drivers that was driving private industry aside from public was the one thing that I had to get my mind wrapped around. Obviously, when you come from a federal side, DoD, uniform service, you have the things that are promoting what your mission focus is going to be, what we're all doing here, and we all understand what that mission focus is. And then when you take that hat off and take the uniform down and get into the civilian sector, that's when things are very different. And it's just about adapting. But the problem solving mindset that we all adjust to and understand that we're taught, you bring into that landscape. And what I found is that it's a bit of a refreshing situation. Many folks do enjoy the breadth of what we bring to the table when it comes to problem solving and understanding many different problem styles. Every journey to get to maturity or get to a benchmark is all different. And we've had the benefit of just seeing a breadth of different things that's going to be brought to you, and bringing that problem solver mentality was the one thing that I felt like, even with the change, it was still a positive situation. It worked out really well for me.
I think a lot of things people say going from the NSA or going to the military to the civilian world, there's a lot of things that transfer over. You want to feel that, man, the NSA should have a good handle on it. But in some cases, they're struggling too as well. Anything that's going digital and the use of encryption, and just even the NSA's on struggling things. And it makes you feel like even if they're struggling with it, no wonder we're struggling with it in the civilian worlds when we don't have nearly as much resources or tools and so forth. But so that kind of leads us into Aaron. I was going to ask about the 2022 look back on the threat landscape. What did we get right? What did we miss? We saw things like SolarWinds and Log4j and just a lot of stuff that's happening at that time. But what was some things that you noticed from the 2022 threat landscape, some of the things that we learned that we can glean from for the future here?
Yeah, 2022 was a really great example of how great this industry is and how supportive it can be and collaborative it is across all organizations. And Log4j was really a good example of that. And SolarWinds in its own right, given that Log4j occurred and it was around the holidays, if everyone wants to remember. And so people were working with skeleton crews, but you saw threats coming out. People were sharing as much information as they could. And there was this almost massive effort, regardless of who worked for whom and all of these other situations, where we were just constantly updating our clients and customers with new mitigations, new movements that we were seeing. But it did highlight a big problem that we have in the supply chain. And we do know that organizations are concerned about supply chain risk management. And Log4j was a really great highlight of that. This was a vulnerability first that was then exploited. And it follows the pathline that we at our organization recognize as being 48 to 72 hours. That vulnerability comes out, you've got that much time before it starts getting actively targeted by threat actors. And that proved fairly positive with Log4j, but we did see a lot of that. And that's a lot of what we got right. We got right the reaction to it, the information sharing, the opening of the floodgates, and the supporting to help everyone try to mitigate a threat. And what we didn't see was competitiveness and blockades being put up and companies attempting to rise above the fray. We didn't see any of that. And that makes this entire culture and cybersecurity a really great industry because of that. Things that we did miss that does somewhat connect to solar winds was Russia. How did we miss the aggression that we saw come in Ukraine? All of the signs were there, but how many organizations were caught flat-footed when Russia invaded Ukraine? And then you had industries that had offices in there, activism targeting their senior executives and CEOs, and then people not knowing the plan. What do we do if we have to break off any of our network communications within Ukraine or even within Russia? How do we respond to a massive geopolitical event like this without properly understanding and having that playbook? But in reality, this aggression is years old, and it's part of the problem with having too much of a focus. When you just say the word cyber, you think it has to be bits and bytes, and you don't realize there's people behind those keyboards. There's nations influencing these decisions, and there's an entire geopolitical aspect and a holistic approach that people can take to intelligence to better inform their customers and their clients out there on what's going on in the world and how it's going to affect you next week and next year and next decade. And we can do that, and that's normal intelligence. But it's just not something that's been fostered, I think, within the community. There's been too much of a technical focus and not enough of a holistic focus throughout these programs.
That's a good point. Nate, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Aaron's not wrong. I can call out specifically when Log4j actually came out. It was, I was in a grocery store, and you, Josh Nicholson, gave me a call to jump on with a very high profile client that we had to run down an event that we were soon to find out that was Log4j. And we hit boots on ground and had reaction and took our process for what we had, which was very, and was able to stay ahead of the curve. Whereas I saw many other clients struggle with understanding how to identify, struggle with understanding the footprint. The biggest thing that I get day in and day out from CISOs all the way down to technical experts is, what does our actual footprint look like? And oftentimes your maturity model is really going to dictate what that answer is. And when you have these instances of celebrity-based vulnerabilities that pop with proof of concept shortly after, oftentimes that question is a great question to ask, but it's oftentimes too late. So you're playing a reactionary game to try to mitigate what these things look like. What I will say is that Aaron's profile on global events when it comes to threat intel spanning outside of the technical field is a big deal. I eat up a threat intel that talks about geopolitical events. What does the landscape look like outside of the technical field? I care about that type of stuff because it helps inform what we should be thinking about progressively. When I got to get in front of a CISO and tell them why this technical thing matters, but also some historical intent behind it that really captures an audience so much more than this is a bad vulnerability. This is also a bad vulnerability with an intent from a nation state that could go far worse.
Well, two of the benefits I saw of threat intelligence, we saw real world, was a client we're talking about where it was a big pharmaceutical, and we had Log4j was pervasive in their environment, but we were really confused at the time whether, and I don't know, remember what the version number was, like 1.118 or 1.119, whatever it was. Yep. 1.118 was supposed to be patched and fixed, but you can still obfuscate the attack and it still works successfully on 1.18. And so now we went through a massive, now you're going to put 1.19, but we were relying on vendors telling us that. And this is where we used one of our tool sets, breach attack simulation, where we attempted those exploits, the Log4j exploits on those machines, and we were able to tell, was it vulnerable? Did we get a positive response back? Yes or no? And I think that active testing is where we would say, no, it's still vulnerable. We still need to patch it. And then we had some frustration from infrastructure people going, what, patch it again? It just took me a week to go patch it. And so not knowing that version was still vulnerable and having to patch it, it was just a real kind of nightmare. So I think what we recommend to a lot of our clients is you want to be able to adapt to these environments or these changing events. Is inventory is key. You got to know, you can't protect what you don't know exists. So having that CMDB, understanding what your technology assets are, where Log4j have even installed it, where do you have Java even installed it? I think all these become very important. It's really hard for threat intelligence people. It's really hard for incident response people to compensate for lack of information of what the landscape looks like. You could say, hey, our scanners are not seeing any of this type of host open or this vulnerability, but just not really having that inventory, I think, causes some difficulties. I think as well as knowing when to push the button on a vulnerability. You may have something that's a high risk and it's a CVV 8 or 9 or whatever, pretty high score. At the same time, is it our only exposure deep down in some piece of infrastructure that's on manufacturing that would never see the light of day anyway? So yes, it's important to patch it, but the probability of exploiting that where in its current environment is almost nothing. You'd have to have physical access to one of the plants. So I think you have to put in that perspective. And I think that's where IT and the other business lines want to hear. They don't want to hear that we just took some list from Microsoft that said this was critical and we're going to force an implementation or patching of that in some production systems and blow some up unless we got this right. And if we have this right and we understand it and there's some risk analysis towards it, the second event where I saw threat intelligence really help is it was a different client where we were at the CISO's meeting and she was discussing ransomware protection and so forth. And I had just gotten an intel brief, and I think it was from Aaron on one of our intel briefings. And it said that ransomware actors were targeting victims who did not pay to have their data restored as part of the ransomware, did not pay. And so performs a denial of service on that host, on that company. And I remember going through that with the CISO and saying, yeah, we see this as a trend. Our threat intelligence team picked that up as a 10. I'm just curious, what is your denial of service control capabilities? Do you have anything that's there? And you got to remember, this is very large pharmaceutical, so tens of thousands of employees. So big infrastructure. So what are you going to do if that's hit with a denial of service? And then she said, let me hold up. I'm going to go back and I'm going to find out. And went back and found out from the project team, they had one on the books. It got delayed for funding reason, for whatever reason, and it did not go production. So she immediately ordered the team, yeah, let's go ahead and do this. We're going to pay for this. Let's implement this solution. 3 months later, they stood it up and it was live for 2 days when everyone got hit with like 88 gig denial of service off of one of the main towers. So it brought down all access to O365. It brought down access to a number of different major cloud platforms because of all the internet connectivity that came out of that tower. And I think they were able to activate it and start mitigating and scrubbing that DDoS within about 4 to 5 hours. It could have come up quicker, but it wasn't tested. For the solution to come up, there's GRE tunnels that have to be established. And when you're under heavy load, it can't establish these GRE tunnels. And so it was really hard to get it up and running. But once it was up within that 4-hour time period, it was mitigating an 8 gig denial of service. Saved us, saved the company. And it was all because there was a threat intelligence brief that came to someone who is on the cybersecurity team, who's running the Cyber Fusion Center. And it was actionable to me and came up in conversation. So that's a prime example where a lot of people are threat intelligence could just help me find some IOCs of something that's in the past that something happened. And it's a terrible way of looking at it. And it's so rudimentary in that way. But how does it help me navigate future disasters is where kind of my thoughts. Have y'all run into that experience too, where threat intelligence actually came up and saved it?
I would always say that we've saved the day all the time, but that's because I was the guy doing it. No, I mean, it's interesting because to the point that you just made, the example that you just gave, there's an organization, it's not one that we work with, but it was partnered with one of our clients wanting to take a look at that potential third party that just had this happen. They had a ransomware incident and the ransomware operators knew that they contacted law enforcement and they immediately moved to it. And having people be aware of that absolutely is something that's a good way to have someone rope in. But to what you were saying, when we were reviewing what was going on with Russia and Ukraine, there were a lot of briefings and a lot of questions that came out on what other geopolitical events do we need to be concerned about. And so we have seen organizations move towards that and been able to inform them to have them prepared for situations like what we saw in the future of just recently, whether it be some of the protests that happened in China or some of the events that are happening in South America and things like that. So that's a point where we've been able to really get ahead of it and really prepare a lot of customers and clients for understanding those movements. But it can also just be, the best example I can give is how often we look. When I was at Army Cyber Command, we read news all the time. You don't just sit there. There's no downtime. If you're not making something, read through. And one of my analysts at Army Cyber Command looked up at me, and I'll always remember it, and said, there's something wrong with the national health system in the United Kingdom. That's weird. And so we said, we need to start taking a look at it. And I don't know if anyone remembers,
Yeah.
that was the first big victim of WannaCry.
Yeah.
And so because of that situation, because she had got eyes on that quickly, and we really started digging, and of course we had the wonderful connections of the government, we started seeing it. And at first they thought it was like a ransomware event or something, but we were immediately informing people that a large government entity had gone down. We weren't sure why, but we really needed to start taking measures to get ahead of it. And because we were just that little bit more advanced and ahead of the curve, it really helped us prepare our command and our leadership for the oncoming weeks and weeks of briefings and mitigation and work, just to ensure that we were not hit by something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Nate, when we look at the world of intelligence analysis, and I'm not just talking about Humit and Signet and all that kind of stuff, but more of on the cyber side of this, where as an organization, what makes sense to be, let's just say I'm 2,000 employees, what makes sense? What does a rudimentary cybersecurity program look like? What should I focus on first? What does good look like? Everybody who may be listening here says, you know what, I want a threat intelligence program. I want to do better. Where do I really start from? Do I do it from a tactical, I want to have a tip deployed and I want to deploy IOCs, or should I hire one? And obviously we're prone to the hire model because that's what we do and we assist customers. And not too many of our customers have full threat intelligence teams themselves. They use people like us to do that. But if you had to advise that head of security that just came in and was been told by the board, hey, you need to invest more in a cyber threat program, what would I do? What would be the first things I should look for?
That's a real good question, because we've been talking about journeys between you and myself and our teams. What does a cyber journey look like? And what I would say is that everyone's journey is just a little bit different, and everyone, it's just based on their priorities, benchmarks, what a board wants, what stockholders want to pursue. And what I would say is that if you're getting into the realm of where you're trying to identify, what to do next, I would identify that you're probably asking yourself that question, namely around the idea that you're trying to go on your own maturity journey, and you want to get out of the reactionary basis stock where you're getting alerts in. There's little to no contextualization behind it. We really can't capture why it's happening. We know the alert's there. We know why it's coming from, but there's really nothing behind it. We don't have any association for it. There's no enrichment. And you want to take your model and your SOC to, what is it going to look like next? I need to get more threat informed. And that's usually when I talk to folks and suggest what should be coming next. I always leverage, you need to bring on a threat intel capability. That one's going to leverage a tip, which is natural. A good threat informed is great, but also getting that understanding that we need to take what they're bringing to the table, making it relevant to what the business model needs to, what they want to look like and what they want to see. Obviously, everybody has what threat informed things they want to see based upon their business model. But taking that, bridging an assessment and understanding what they want to see out of it, building out what it looks like for them, and then building unique use cases that's going to give them that contextualization across, not just telling them what they should be focusing on, what tradecraft threat actors are doing that could theoretically be affecting their agencies or their products, but also informing a company at large. What I've noticed is as the maturity model grows, the threat intel that is provided stems across an entire enterprise. And it goes far and wide, and it informs culture at its root, and informs these are the things we should be paying attention to. This is, and because of X, Y, and Z, because of this third party, because of this ransomware attack, because of this nation state action. This is why we need to focus on this stuff. This is why we need to be informed to make a decision. The CISO back channels, if you will, are very informative when it comes to understanding needs, when it comes to what people are talking about, and understanding why it affects your company and why it is necessary at many levels of the journey. One, it keeps you in the mode of growing with something that's going to grow with you, and having a threat intel program that starts off small and informative, that grows into flash notifications, niche alerting that we can create and give to threat detection engineers, to then theoretically publishing out to ISAC, being the tip of the spear, showcasing what we are the focal point because we see this on a scale that surpasses many others. And then you become the informant. You become the people that people want to look to for this niche intelligence. And that's when you've really hit a really awesome peak. You're the informer.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Aaron, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, It's a real hard thing because, everybody has their own thing that can fit. And step one is, how do you educate your workforce? Because nobody wants to say this, but your workforce is your primary vector of approach for threat actors. It's still the most successful way for threat actors to access your network is through spear phishing emails, SEO poisoning, and your employees being socially engineered and clicking a bad link or opening a bad attachment. And step one is figuring out where to get the good information that you need, and then how to inform your workforce to make sure that you reduce that attack surface as much as possible. But secondarily is understanding what your actual landscape is. A lot of people have a problem of, you read a lot of headlines, and so every big headline, when you see it on all the major publications, you think this must be my top problem. Everyone's talking about this malware. It must be my top problem. But that's not true. You need to do, we call it a threat landscape. We honestly just stole the concept from the military because that's where Nate and I cut our teeth and grew up. It's called intelligence preparation of the battlefield. You need to know where you're at. Where are you on the map? Who are your peer organizations? What's hitting them? Historically, what has affected your industry vertical? Because just because in Twitter or whomever, is saying that this is the biggest threat to you, our biggest threat out there, it may not even be looking at you. That could be attacking banks, and you could be an auto manufacturer. You need to know what your landscape is, because while you're looking at the big celebrity over there, someone's going to sneak in that back door and they're going to take down your organization just the same. And you could have caught it if you just paid attention to where you fit and who's targeting you specifically.
And do you find most customers have a hard time determining that and really seeing the value of intelligence? Obviously, all three of us are military. I'm Marine, you're Army, he's Navy, and we have Air Force guys. So we got all four branches. It's real interesting because we all get along. We don't kid each other and beat each other up too much. But I think threat intelligence or intelligence is understood in the military context, but not really in the civilian context really at all. A Marine would never consider going and hit a target in combat without having an intelligence assessment on how big that target is and what's the difficulties I'm going to reach and how many, just knowing, so you just don't go into a situation you get wiped out. And so I think the same thing is prevalent throughout the military, but not always as prevalent in the civilian world. They don't think the first thing I'm going to do before I go into this area, this geo or whatever, I'm going to do a threat assessment. If anything, it's more of a business risk assessment. I might get sued? What are my labor laws? They take it from that. But as far as operating environment that we have, like some customers are American companies that want to work in China. How do we protect them from the Chinese government that may not always have their interest at heart? And so how do you do that while balancing and focusing the organization and just being a part of it? I think sometimes you don't have threat intelligence guys are there with the executives always helping to make some of those decisions. And I really think that's a mistake. I think some of the risk assessments you see done, and in my background, I worked at Young, I was at Wells Fargo as a group information security officer. So I've been leading cyber teams for a long time. And I will notice that a lot of times the strategy and the risk management functions don't take threat intel into account at all. It was more of the control says it's supposed to do X, so I'm going to test to see if it does X. If it does a little bit of X and a little bit of Y, I'm fine. I went through the report. So they've never really taken, it was more from a compliance approach that they would think that they're doing risk management and never take into account real threat intelligence on that area. And so that's where I see a big difference of it. And I just don't think there's enough companies that are leveraging threat intelligence in a good way because of those deficiencies. They just don't really understand how would I use it other than in a tip format, because it makes sense where I would have some detection and analysis done. I'm pulling it apart. I find that is bad. I want to create some indicator of it. I want to be able to tell the entire world. How do I do that? I tell it via some IOC distribution, some data push that's a part of it. But how does that actually play in everything else you do? I think is just underutilized in the industry. Some of the other things for the year, what do you think we got? What do you think we got wrong, Aaron? If you had an approach that says, you know what, I would love for most of our customers to start doing X, or a lot of people in the industry start doing X, I think it would have a huge improvement. Maybe from a short-term perspective, push the ball forward from a short-term maturity perspective versus something strategically, you should be looking to do this. And that's like a 2-3 year roadmap. But what should I focus on first? Have those pieces in place before the bigger strategic ones.
I think that what a lot of parts of the industry are getting right is they understand the concern over identity management and cloud. They at least understand that this is something that needs to be focused on and that it is an attack vector that needs to be considered. And there's obviously always benefits, and that's going to be a big part of 2023 as well, as moving forward with a lot of those types of solutions as everyone moves even more and there's more offerings and abilities of what exists for cloud management and identity focus. But what people get wrong still historically is, it's funny because it's almost the opposite of what I said earlier, but once you have your organization focused on being able to get good threat intelligence and contextualize threats, you have to understand that really leaning forward is also understanding everything else that is also out there. Step one when developing and maturing your organization is knowing what's targeting you, but that doesn't stop there. To get ahead of the curve on a lot of these things is knowing how ransomware operators are changing their tactics, techniques, and procedures. How are nation states moving their focal points, and what are they targeting? Because one of the biggest problems we have when maturing organizations, and where I think they get a lot of it wrong, is they want to demand, how does this apply to me? I only want to know if it affected my peer. I only want to know if it affected my industry. But you're at a point now where you can get ahead and you can be that tip of the spear. You're not going to do that if you're only caring about you and not watching how your enemy, I'll say it that way, is developing. And that's where a lot of people miss it, is threat intelligence doesn't start at looking at your organization. It looks at the enemy. That is our job. Our job is to understand your adversary and then understand how that adversary can affect you. It's not the other way around. You have plenty of people that are looking inside your wall. You need me looking outside of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I think over the years, it's really morphed into a lot of different aspects. I just don't think you had a real mature or a real understanding of threat intelligence in a lot of these organizations. So what do y'all think, guys? What is the big trend? What are we going to see more of 2023? One of my predictions is we're going to have another celebrity vulnerability of some sort. There's going to be some driver, some executable, something somewhere that if you pull it, the whole linchpin of the internet falls apart. And we're all back in the caveman days. What is that you think is going to be the next one? GPS satellites, for instance. What happens when we lose GPS satellites? What do we think is the next big threat vector?
I guess I'll kick us off, and Aaron, feel free to chime in. And mind you, I would say supply chain, in my opinion, is going to be the name of the game, Josh. I feel like where we are right now globally, based on many nations at war right now, large portions of nations actually provide a tremendous amount of resources globally. I feel like that's going to be the next thing that kind of takes us to a very hard point in time, and that I feel like it's going to give us some retroactive thinking of how we can project these things moving forward. But I feel like the supply chain is going to be what's targeted really next. Fuel, food, that's going to be a big hit. Waterways, all of these things I feel like are all going to be like prime. Everyone wants to level up. Every threat actor wants to get it to that next level. And every threat actor has their intent and has their intentions as far as what they want to do. And I feel like as we look at what everybody's grown accustomed to, the ransomware based style of attacks, to where people now are understanding how to adjust, how to augment, how to back up on what they're going to do. Where now I believe the next area is going to be actual real disruption on a global scale that's more noticeable and more affected. Outside of seeing price rises, I feel like it's gonna really hit people, not just in a pocket, but in a day-to-day living process.
So is it almost, we had a really interesting time period here. I got stuck with all this air travel problems. So we had the Southwest Airlines computer meltdown, right? We have the FAA computers go down at the same time. I'm also heard from a guy on LinkedIn, I haven't verified these stories, but you had Air Canada and another airliner go down too as well. When do you start looking at these events and going, is this systemic of old computer systems that people didn't spend money and time to replace? Or is this where we're actually seeing cyber warfare here? We're actually seeing malicious activity? Is this part of that Russian response? In the beginning, when the war first kicked off, from a U.S. perspective, didn't see a real uptake in cyber war. It's almost like they were distracted with Ukraine, and there was some government attacks that were there that was facilitating as part of like Aaron was saying, prepping the battle space, so to speak, for your operations. But it just seemed that they were real focused on that and not some of the other traditional areas. Does that make sense?
I mean, if you want me to do the standard intel guy, I'm going to scare you real quick. We didn't see them, which means that maybe they didn't need to. Maybe they're already in the areas of infrastructure they need to be. There didn't need to be any prep. We didn't need to see them coming in because maybe they're already implanted in there. It would be smart to do if you were a nation state and you knew at some point you were going to have some sort of conflict with another major nation state. You would already prep yourself. You would already be sitting in the areas that you needed to. And so, in fact, I would say the lack of movement that we saw from Russia when these things intensified, that is actually something on the government side as an advisor. And I know that this is happening within the intelligence community. I would be immediately advising commanders and stakeholders. That's actually more concerning than not. It's very concerning that we're not seeing them because it suggests that they don't need to implant. We need to start looking closer at our infrastructure. But to Nate's point about the supply chain, the roadmap was laid out for everybody during the pandemic. When it comes to nation state threats, they actually saw how every country can get pinched in which way by how prices rose, how people reacted. And a really good one would be you couldn't buy a new car in the United States for a while just because of the chip manufacturing. So there's actually been a roadmap for adversarial nations, like specifically if you want to look at the United States, I know how to pinch them. This thing leads to this, then it leads to that. Whole roadmap's been laid out, and it's a perfect and wonderful target. And to the point that you just made, I'll tie it together, a lot of which is operated by very old systems that can systemically break and almost waterfall down. And that's me taking the approach of, let's just say that all of these airlines were just happen to be computer glitches. I'm suspicious of it, but that's also my job, to be suspicious and ask a lot of hard questions. I have seen the pattern, Josh. I'll acknowledge that. But because I respect your program, I'm not going to put my tinfoil hat on and start telling you all the things that it could be. But that is also another way that you have to approach intelligence. You have to ask every single question and then disprove whether or not it's possible. You should be a little paranoid when working with intelligence.
Yeah, it's all good points. And I think understanding how you see some coincidence, you don't necessarily see correlation, but you see some coincidence that, hey, this big system goes down and affects air travel. Then this big one goes down and affects air travel. And then others affect an air travel. It'd be one thing if the McDonald's computer system went down. I wouldn't be so panicked, right? One McDonald's goes down, but it's not the airline. But when you have multiple airline industry and how it can just date the traveling public, I was stuck in Newark for 3 days. You were going to tell me 3 days before my next flight, all because of those computer systems. And yet you wonder, how did we lose the ability to fly a plane without a scheduling system? Okay, so it's one thing that this says what pilots go where, but you would think if there's somebody you would call that has a clipboard that says Jet 445, you could go fly to Houston, and he can fly the thing and doesn't need a whole computer scheduling program. It's almost like your Microsoft Outlook calendaring went down, how you would just be useless the whole day. No, somehow we'd figure out how to still meet with each other. You just would figure that airlining would be a little bit more than just relying on a computer system for them. For that. But I think that's where we are from a society perspective.
That's Absolutely. True. The focus on it makes things easier, and it makes things cheaper, and it makes them run faster. But that's part of the problem is we do become very reliant on that technology, but we also need to build in redundancies. To your earlier point, though, when you say coincidence, I used to yell at my soldiers, and so I feel like you're using this against me. I used to yell at my soldiers that there's no coincidences in intelligence.
Sounds like a paranoid thing an intelligence would say. Yeah. And I think it's when you don't have the intelligence background and you have more of a network security background, sometimes it's a little harder to understand collection, dissemination, curation, all the different things that you do to make something actionable. A lot of times they think of it as like an antivirus signature. You just sit here and it uploads and it's able to tell me when bad happens. And I think that's just such a rudimentary way of thinking of intelligence. And what I liked about cybersecurity coming from the Marine Corps is just so many aspects of it match the military mindset. From you have a defensive position of this, you have an offensive, there's an actual enemy that's coming there trying to smash you and take your stuff. So it was much more fascinating, I found, than IT, where it was some error. I'd have to go look in TechNet to figure out what component was broken and let me patch that, or reg entry to fix that. To me, that wasn't fun and exciting, but taking the dimension of warfare in the cyber realm perfectly matches that, because there's a complete understanding about that. So a hardening of my defenses on my ASR, my attack surface reduction. How do I reduce attack surface points that may have that the enemy could get a foothold on there? How do I think like an attacker? How do an attacker recon? What is the stuff that they can see about my executives that they can use to fish? Can they see my executives' home numbers? Any of that kind of stuff that would give an intelligence officer, especially an offensive intelligence officer, an understanding on how to target my organization is what I would want to go after. That would mean sanitizing the website for email addresses that they don't need to have. I think in some cases it's changing SMTP addresses up so it's not easily guessable. And there's a number of different things that we can make harder. But when I was in the banking financial institutions, we had a lot of ACH fraud. We had people would log on to the wire transfer system and they would transfer it out. Now, the first time that happened, I get brought in by the CEO and the CIO. And they said, look, we need to do an assessment. It looks like we keep getting hit on the wire transfer system. So went, did an assessment, noticed there's no MFA authentication. You can log on from anywhere. They probably got phished. Their credentials are gone. Somebody's logging on somewhere else, initiating the transfers. So what we did is implemented MFA, did RSA tokens on wire initiation. And then that way you couldn't initiate a wire without a token. They said, okay, that won't break our processes too much. That's fine. We can do that. Then the attacker was still able to grab the credentials and steal money. Again, God, how did they steal the token? I said, so we put another token on, one for initiation, separate username and password for authorization and release. Okay, we're going to prevent this. There's no way they're going to be stealing money out of the ACH system again. Nope, $100,000 went out the door. Crap. What happened? Why does this keep happening? So I went down to the wire transfer department myself and sat there and watched the manager. And I said, okay, initiate a wire. Show me you doing it. And she grabs the paper that came in through the fax and she goes to initiate the wire. And everything's great from the initiation standpoint. And I said, okay, so they use the token. Okay, I see you initiated. How do you authorize it? And she reaches in the dress. She grabs another token with a little piece of paper on it. And she logs on with that token and approves it right there on the same desktop. Her desktop was compromised. The attacker saw the every time she did it. So she violated a process which said there had to be two separate people, one for initiation, one for release. Yet that person was on vacation. So that person gave him the token and the user password. So the one person was sitting there doing wire transfers and we couldn't figure out what was happening. Why? Because they had a process breakdown they violated. Had no idea they were violating that process there. And so I thought it was really interesting how these attackers learned to get around them. A second scam I ran across is my nephew was going to get a rental property here in Charlotte. So I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he was getting a rental property and he saw it on one of those Zillow sites and it says you can get this property. I think it was $1,500 a month for rent. And it looked like a really good deal for 3-bedroom, $1,500 for rent. And so he replied to the ad and said, hey, I want to go see it. And he gives them a link here, go sign up for this. And it'll give you a token code to actually get into the place. And so they do that. He gets into the place and he sees it. He really likes it. He wants to give a down payment for it. And so he gets the standard rental contract, says, Uncle Josh, I want you to take a look at this just to make sure it's good and it's solid. And so I started looking through the contract and it looks like just a regular contract. It looks normal from a T's and E's perspective. It looks like anything somebody would sign. But I saw the name and I asked, so who owns that property? And one of my biggest concerns is that you rent the property out and somebody doesn't have the money and the AC breaks and you're screwed for the week with no air conditioner because the guy has no money to fix it. And so I much rather a company that does. That way I know they have money, they're going to replace the thing. I always thought it was really important to do that. So I start looking up the guy, what's his background, where's he at? Let me talk to him. But one thing his girlfriend told me that keyed me in, she says, I saw the exact same property for $300, $400 less on Craigslist, or $300, $400 more on Redfin, so one of the official sites there. And I said, that's really strange. Same address, same everything? It's the same address, same everything. It's $300, $400 less off of Craigslist. So we called, we said, that's really strange. Why would it be these two different prices? So I started talking to the guy, and long story short, to find out it was a complete scam. He didn't own that place. So what he did is he put a Craigslist mapping up there of that property. When you ask to get to the place, he actually sends you to the real estate place to get the code for it, to unlock it. And you fill out the information, it sends the code. So when you get into the property, you assume the guy owns it because he just gave you a code to get into it. How else would he get? It was the ultimate way of proving in his mind that you had that. And no, come to find out that was all a scam, and he was going to have $2,000 transferred. We never would have seen it again. It was just a really horrible incident, nearly wiped him out from that perspective. Now, I went back into some old news that I saw, and there was some threat intelligence that said that there was scams related to these housing things on Craigslist and a look out for them and all that kind of stuff. I'm only thinking was, what if I wasn't there to A, ask all these inquisitive questions, right? But B, that there's information out there related to those scams. How do you get that when these situations are occurring? And it's a real interesting thing to focus on. Like, for instance, when you have a third party that provides you risk, it's really hard to, or you provide you service, it's really hard to figure out, are they compromised? Are they doing security right? Are they going to notify us when this happens? How all that kind of works out. It just seems to be a real challenge in enterprises today. Would y'all agree to that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, third-party stuff is fantastic. And, it's another good program that needs to be stood up. Who are your suppliers? Who are your vendors? Who has connections into your network? And how are you monitoring in case they get compromised? So you can shut that down. You can stop email traffic. You can stop incoming traffic till they assure you they've been cleared and everything's fine. You don't want to become a victim of a victim.
Yeah, Nate
yeah,
and I
absolutely
deal with this a lot on third-party incidents, where we had our incident response team at one of our big clients were constantly engaged with third parties more than first-party events. They didn't have enough time for first-party events that were occurring in their own network, because we had so many third-party events that were occurring. You had ransomware connections. And so we had to get them, if you remember, Nate, to think back of how do you segment, just like a ship in the Navy and it gets hit by a torpedo, you have these waterhead bulkheads, and how do you seal that part of the ship off so the rest doesn't sink? And when you look at it from a network perspective, that's easier said than done. Everything's connected in many ways. So you, especially in cloud environment, you got to be very careful to understand, how do I shut this off? How do I prevent this third party's connectivity? And should I think about this before I even set them up? I shouldn't have an incident and then go, I wonder how we're all connected. What should I do to protect it? Because some of it, remember, if they were ransomware, we were shutting off email because we didn't want ransomware distributed via email. We also had secure FTP jobs where they were moving data and third parties were moving data. So now we had to consider that potentially compromised. What else did we have? We actually had network connections and API connections to different systems, as well as like third-party landing, like S3 buckets that were occurring. So it became a tremendous challenge, I think, in many ways, to really get our hands around it, right?
What I would say, Josh, and piggybacking off the initial comments, was when it came to taking on more third-party events and incidents more than our own, that's a correct statement. What I will say is that our program that we had in place was extremely mature. We had a tremendous amount of use case development, analyst understanding of what they should be paying attention to. And that took a lot of time and effort to put that into play, to where, yes, we did have a tremendous amount of hand working with third parties, following through as an incident commander, understanding what was affected, getting TTPs, implementing countermeasures within our own environment to mitigate things that we may or may not see. But what I will say is that we were so quick about getting things like that in play and on the road from third parties that by the time you knew it, we were already well and above understanding. We have a process down that's tight, from blocking off certain network aspects, understanding what the inbound, outbound looks like, understanding what the potential footprint, their level of attack would look like, leveraging our threat intel capability. I look at Aaron because he's the guy that informs me, because when I hear about a third party, I immediately look at my threat intel analyst and I say, what do we have on the dark web? What are we seeing when it comes to these things? I need to understand, because I can sit and wait all day long for a third party to get in contact with me, knowing very well they're probably going through an investigation. The very fact that I'm hearing about it right now tells me this probably happened 2 weeks, a month. So understanding how we can take a reactionary base from that position and moving forward with that and investigating what the near real time look like, what do the events look like, and that it really really showcases your maturity model in that moment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the the thing about the third parties is that there's no contextualization from it. Okay, it's a third party. They do 3-4 things for us. They do some things to some data and they send it back. Or we even have more complexity where we have a fourth party. It's like a repository cloud system for a third party, but we have no contracts with them. They're a fourth party. And it just really gets down the rabbit hole. And how do you, and then when we're dealing with these third and fourth parties, they're in the middle of an incident, so they don't even talk to you. And you're trying to get information for your management team, but they're not even going to talk to you. And when they do, they're going to wait for their lawyers, and it's going to be 2-3 days from now. So you can't even quantify the risk back to your management team because these guys are ghosting you because they don't even know what to say. And we notice that, right, of where when they're in the middle of an incident, these incident commanders and these IR security guys you've been working with for a long time, all of a sudden shut up and they're not saying anything. And it's why they're under legal constraints. They can't say anything. And then what do? How do I proactively shut that service down? I don't know really the situation. I'm going to be impacting business. And so now you have cybersecurity guys making massive business decisions at the same time, but what needs to be cut off, what doesn't. I do think there needs to be a holistic approach that says when we start segmenting and shutting down, these are the things that will be impacted. And let's go test it. Let's really start shutting down, take a night, a weekend or whatever. And that's not really big coming from the network security world where I come from. They don't like shutting networks down. But actually walking through that where we do cipher that off, let's see what breaks. Can we operate in this mode for what, an hour or 2 hours? We can't because the FTP servers won't update or something to that effect. You at least know the risk posture, what's happening. But I think there's too many organizations do not take the approach of actively testing their countermeasures, and let's actually block things over. Let's fail over to backup links. Let's assume the firewall is going to crap itself. Let's go over to the secondary. How do we reroute? I think some of these situations we can easily plan for them doesn't get planned because people don't have time to do their day job, let alone do advanced planning for things they think might never happen. But it does seem like we do need to put that more into tabletop exercises where it's not just this incident happened with this person came in or we have this activity, but this major thing got knocked out too. So work with cyber and the disaster recovery team at the same time. How we do that, because recovery of the system can be completely different than we want from a security perspective. We don't want that system coming up now because of X, Y, and Z, but because of their model on how to get something up, I need that up A, I need that up in B or whatever it may be. So I think there needs to be a little bit more consolidated or considerate approach towards it. And then how do we actually move a flock of birds? You and I have been in situations where we had big enterprises and they have 15, 20 different people. That's the firewall guy. That's the idea. And it was so distributed in so many different people, just getting them to operate in a consolidated manner in a critical situation without requiring 15 different tickets for 15 different teams. It was just been a massive problem. So I think as we start to look at how do you operationalize this, companies need to ask themselves, do they even effectively communicate themselves when normally? Am I distributed? Is my network team, I have to open a ticket. If I need a proxy block or I need a firewall block, is that really just a ticket? Is that streamlined for you to actually action something really quick? And I just see some of them are not. It's more of a responsibility, bureaucratic ticket passing than it is a true functional org. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Josh. And you raised a really great, fun topic that I want to just touch on real quick. Is there was a client that I supported there for a while, very mature when it came to their cyber fusion center. And they had an on-site red team that I helped stand up. And what I will say is having that capability from just talking about red team specifically, which was informed by threat intel as far as what the capabilities of what threat actors were doing, we would normally on the fly, anytime we would get any sort of proof of concept on the street, we would usually have a mirrored environment where we could test near real time whether or not our defense and death posture actually works. I'll literally be in front of an executive director of a cyber fusion center, a CISO, and they want to know, am I affected by this? And having that near real time data of here's why you do, here's why you don't. Here's what I was able to do. Here's what I'm able to see from these various attack vectors, external, internal, and showcase the various styles of visibility from that aspect. And I think that really shows and attests making those critical answers. Do I need to patch within the next 24 hours or do I have 72? Because those time frames matter in those moments. If I can tell somebody we can take a mild breath, we still need to push, but the complexity in which this style of attack has to happen is very complex. And we have a really good posture. We're monitoring, we're ahead of the curve. Threat intel is informing us on near real-time data points when it comes to TTPs, IOCs, if you will, and we stay ahead of the game that way, which allows engineers, on-site leaders, production environments to come to the table and actually put a realization timetable to remediate.
Yeah, I see how much we've been in some of these big CSERTs where we have a celebrity vulnerability, and how the IT, the patch management team, the sysadmins are just so grateful for having threat-informed attack surface reduction functionality, because everything before was critical to them. This needs to happen right away. And so if everything's critical, then nothing's critical. And so since there was no vetting and nobody ever said, actually, you could take the next couple of days to do this because the threat is this. When you just take it from an immature perspective, just say, just because it says high on this rating from whoever provided it, that this is vulnerable and this needs to be there, that does not mean that's really a high risk to you. It's just mean in general, it's a high risk. How it is reflected to you takes analysis and takes somebody to take a look at. And I remember saying, yes, we do have, you get about a week or two. We're not going to push you hard on this one. And it was appreciative. People would just push us for everything and just beat us. If it's red, just push it. But for you to actually tell us, I would back off, you don't have to go so hard. They felt there was real intelligence and real partnership with them to help save them, to focus on what's real important and not to say everything's a fire. And I think that's where, when you have those years of experience doing cybersecurity, that's what the benefit to your customers. You can say, yeah, I think we have a little time in this. We don't have time in that, I'll be honest. We need to push over in this area. And having that experience really helps to give that kind of strategic vision that they need.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But guys, I really appreciate y'all's time today. I think we covered a lot in threat intelligence, what's good, what's not. We talked about some of the challenges, the celebrity vulnerabilities, threat intelligence, how to look at it. And I think we're going to have more kind of sessions on this on the broadcast. We also look forward to having Aaron starting a series where we'll do threat intelligence briefings before each of these podcasts. And the objective here really is to empower you, the listener, with actionable information that you can go back to your leadership team. We can start to talking to them about what's important, what's not. And it's not about what is important in your future here based on some sales news articles you saw that some firewall vendor showed you that you must have this cool shiny box. But really, what kind of programs, what kind of systems, what kind of mindset, how should you approach these problems? It's not about the tool. I'll tell you that right now. It's not always about the tool. Do you have capabilities built into a tool that help you make things better, export data better, manage it better, connect it to other things better? It's just greater value. Absolutely. But that's not always the thing you should be focusing on. I think the thing you should be focusing on is having a real good understanding of what your threat intelligence program is and is not, what it encompasses, and then using what tool sets after that once you have your requirements down. And I'm sure Aaron can have a whole class just on the different tips that are out there, the different ways technology uses to aggregate things. And then hopefully we'll get more in that here in the future. The next episode that we're looking at is going to be on incident response and detection analytics. So it's bringing in expertise to talk about how do we use intelligence, but not only that, but how do we go about what is the analytical life cycle? How do I develop them? How do I create a library? How do I deprecate old analytics so I don't have false positives anymore? How do you keep up with that kind of life cycle? And then incident response. We're going to have a head of our incident response capability. We're also looking at a senior IR director for one of our clients that can give some greater perspective on the threats that we're discovering, how we're seeing, and what some of the obfuscation techniques we're seeing attackers have, and what should we be focused on. Until next time, everybody have a good day and happy cyber hunting. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Cybersecurity America on the Voice America Business Channel. We hope you've learned some valuable information to help you be a better executive leader and navigate today's complex world of cybersecurity. Until next week, stay secure.